The grand spaceship of the Zaranthian Empire glided through the star-strewn void, its sleek hull reflecting the light of distant suns. Inside the massive conference room, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Representatives from all corners of the galaxy had gathered for the most important diplomatic summit of the century. Humanity had been invited to the table, a sign of the growing importance of Earth in the galactic community. For the young human diplomat, this was the moment he had prepared for his entire life. He sat quietly at the edge of the long, polished table, feeling the weight of his responsibility. His mission was clear: represent Earth with honor and secure an alliance with the Zaranthian Empire. The galaxy was a complex place, filled with countless species, each with their own interests and ambitions. But the Zaranthians, with their advanced technology and immense power, were key to humanity's survival and prosperity in this new age of intergalactic relations. The human diplomat's gaze shifted around the room. His fellow humans sat at the table, exchanging tense whispers, while representatives from other species remained silent, their alien faces impassive. But it was Queen Lyria, the ruler of the Zaranthian Empire, who commanded the most attention. Her regal presence filled the room, her deep blue skin shimmering like the depths of an ocean, her eyes reflecting the cold, distant stars outside. She was everything the diplomat had read about in the reports: intelligent, calculating, and unyielding in her leadership. The queen entered the room with the air of someone accustomed to power, her movements graceful yet assertive. As she approached the table, all eyes turned toward her. Her gaze swept over the assembled diplomats before she took her seat, and it was then that the human diplomat realized just how close she was sitting to him. He had expected to sit across from her, at least 2 seats away. But now, the queen was seated so close that he could almost feel the heat radiating from her. The diplomat tried to maintain his composure, but his pulse quickened. It wasn't just her proximity that unnerved him. It was the sheer force of her presence. As Earth's representative, he had met with leaders of various species, but none had the same magnetic aura as Queen Lyria. She exuded an authority that was impossible to ignore, even if she said nothing. His mind raced as the meeting began, with various topics being discussed in rapid succession. The importance of the summit weighed heavily on him, but his thoughts kept returning to the queen, who was seated right beside him. He tried to focus on the conversation, but the hum of the room, the soft murmur of voices, and the occasional glance toward the queen made it nearly impossible. At one point, as he shifted slightly in his chair, his hand brushed against hers. The sensation was electric. His heart skipped a beat, and for a brief moment, everything in the room seemed to freeze. The queen's body stiffened, her posture rigid, and her gaze flickered toward him. A flush of red spread across her cheeks, barely visible against her blue skin, but unmistakable to anyone who was looking. The human diplomat quickly pulled his hand back, his own face flushed with embarrassment. Silence hung in the air for a heartbeat longer than it should have. The queen's expression was unreadable, but her eyes betrayed a hint of surprise, maybe even a trace of confusion. The human diplomat's breath caught in his throat as he tried to recover, focusing on the discussions taking place around him. But no matter how hard he tried, his mind kept drifting back to that moment. The moment when his hand had touched her hip and the queen had frozen in place. As the meeting continued, the human diplomat couldn't help but wonder what had caused her reaction. Was it simply the surprise of being touched unexpectedly, or was there something more to it? He glanced at her again, but this time she was staring intently at the screen ahead, as though the event had never happened. Yet the faintest tension remained in the air between them. Hours passed, and the summit droned on. The various representatives made their points, offering proposals and counter-proposals, while the human diplomat did his best to stay focused. But his attention was divided. Every time he caught a glimpse of Queen Lyria out of the corner of his eye, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment they had shared. It was odd. He had never been particularly nervous in such high-pressure situations before. But here, with the queen so close, everything felt different. The talk shifted to more serious matters: trade agreements, military alliances, and the delicate balance of power between the galactic factions. As Earth's representative, the diplomat was called upon to make critical decisions, but even as he spoke, his words felt hollow. His thoughts were no longer on the negotiations, but on the Queen, sitting beside him. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the meeting came to an end. The representatives stood to leave, exchanging polite nods and murmurs of approval. The Queen, as always, was the last to rise. As she made her way toward the exit, the human diplomat stood as well, his mind still racing. He was about to follow when he noticed that she had stopped. She was standing by the door, her back to him, her hands clasped behind her. For a moment the room was quiet, and the diplomat wondered if he had imagined the entire incident. He had read about the Queen's composed nature, how she never let her guard down. But what if it wasn't an accident? What if the Queen had noticed something too? The thought lingered in his mind. Without thinking, he approached her, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent room. She turned slightly as he approached, her expression neutral, but her eyes betraying a flicker of curiosity. "Your Highness," he began, his voice steady but unsure. "I apologize if my actions were inappropriate during the meeting." "I never meant to." "You didn't," she interrupted, her voice cool but not unkind. "It was simply unexpected." There it was again. The brief pause, the subtle shift in her tone. The human diplomat couldn't help but wonder if there was more behind her words than she was letting on. But before he could ask, the Queen spoke again, this time with an air of finality. "We have much to discuss tomorrow. I suggest we both get some rest." And with that, she turned and exited the room, leaving the diplomat standing alone in the silence. As the door slid closed behind her, he stood still for a moment, contemplating the strange, unexpected encounter. What had just happened, and what would the next meeting bring? He didn't know the answers, but one thing was certain. He would never forget the moment when his hand had brushed against the Queen's hip, and she had frozen in embarrassment. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. The human diplomat retired to his quarters, his mind unable to quiet the storm of thoughts swirling inside him. The encounter with the Queen had shaken him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but he couldn't help but wonder if it was the beginning of something more than just a diplomatic relationship. Could it be possible that their connection ran deeper than mere politics? He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing. Tomorrow would be a new day, and he would face it with a mind open to possibilities. The morning after the tense meeting, the human diplomat awoke to the sound of his communicator vibrating softly on his desk. The cold blue glow of the display illuminated the otherwise dark room. For a moment he sat there, still wrapped in the warmth of his blanket, wondering if last night had truly happened. He had replayed the moment when his hand had brushed against Queen Lyria's hip 1,000 times in his mind. It felt like an eternity ago, but it still lingered. He sat up, shaking off the lingering thoughts, and reached for his communicator. The message was from his superior back on Earth, an update on the summit's progress, and a reminder of the importance of today's discussions. But it was impossible for him to focus on the details. All he could think about was the Queen. The way she had looked at him, her eyes betraying something unexpected. He couldn't help but feel that there was something more to her reaction, something beyond the diplomatic formalities. The diplomat quickly dressed in his uniform, smoothing down the creases of the jacket. It was a simple outfit, professional, with no ornamentation, but it was still an official uniform representing Earth's place in the galaxy. Today's session was crucial. It would determine whether Earth's future in this galactic alliance would be secure. Yet, as he looked at himself in the mirror, he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something more was at stake here than politics. He arrived at the conference room early, as was customary. The table was set with holographic displays and datapads for the negotiations, and the various representatives were already gathering. As he entered, he noticed the Queen at the head of the table, her usual composed demeanor in place. She was reviewing some data on a display, her long fingers flicking through the information with swift precision. She appeared to be in control, as always. But as the diplomat made his way toward his seat, something changed in the air. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The Queen's gaze was focused and intense, yet there was something different about it now. It wasn't the cold, calculating look he had seen before. There was a softness in her eyes, almost like a hidden curiosity, or maybe something more personal. He quickly looked away, his heart racing in his chest. It was absurd. How could he be thinking this way? He was here to represent Earth, to secure an alliance that would benefit his people, and yet all he could think about was the Queen. Was it her power, her beauty, or something more elusive that drew him in? He couldn't say. But the uncertainty gnawed at him. The meeting began as expected. Various topics were discussed: trade agreements, territorial rights, and security protocols. The diplomats from different species argued passionately, their voices rising and falling with the ebb and flow of the conversation. But the human diplomat's focus was scattered. Every time he glanced at Queen Lyria, he found her watching him, her gaze lingering for a moment before she returned to the discussions at hand. Despite the tension in the room, there was a strange sense of familiarity between them. He didn't know what had caused it, but it felt as though they shared something unspoken. Perhaps it was the brush of their hands, the night before. Perhaps it was the fleeting moment of vulnerability she had shown. Whatever it was there, hanging in the air between them, palpable but unacknowledged. As the hours passed, the conversation turned toward Earth's place in the galactic economy. The diplomat spoke with confidence, laying out his arguments in favor of increased trade and cooperation between the Zaranthians and humans. He could feel the Queen's eyes on him, and he knew that her judgment was keen. She was a woman of great intellect, and she could see through any deception or half-truth. Yet, as he spoke, he realized that it wasn't just her sharp mind he was trying to impress. It was her. There was something in the way she listened, in the way her eyes seemed to pierce through him, that made his heart beat faster. The Queen didn't interrupt as he spoke, her expression impassive, but he could feel her presence, like a weight pressing down on him. When he finished, there was a long pause. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned toward her. She took a moment before responding, her voice calm and measured. "Your proposal is reasonable, diplomat," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "But there are complications. There are other factions within the Empire that may not share your optimism for such a partnership." Her words were a subtle challenge, a reminder of the power she held over the situation. She wasn't just a queen. She was a leader with immense authority. And yet, in that moment, the diplomat felt something else. A flicker of something more personal. Something that had nothing to do with the negotiations. It was as if the Queen was testing him, not just as a representative of Earth, but as a person. Was she trying to gauge his strength of character, or was it something else entirely? He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. "I understand, Your Highness," he replied, his voice steady. "But the stakes are too high for humanity. We need the support of the Empire if we are to survive and thrive in this galaxy. I believe that cooperation is the only way forward." The Queen's gaze softened slightly, though her expression remained guarded. For a brief moment, she seemed to consider his words. "I am not unaware of the importance of Earth's future," she said quietly. "But there are those within my court who question the wisdom of such an alliance. Some feel that humanity's involvement could bring more danger than benefit."
The diplomat nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation.
He knew that the Queen was not speaking solely for herself. She was caught in a delicate web of politics, and any decision she made would have far-reaching consequences. But there was something else he couldn't ignore. The way she spoke, the tone of her voice, and the way she was looking at him. It all felt like she was opening up, even if only just a little. The room fell silent once more as the Queen continued, her voice low and thoughtful. But I will not make this decision alone. I will consult with my advisors and see where they stand. For now, we shall continue the discussions. With that, she turned her attention to the other diplomats, her focus shifting back to the negotiations. The human diplomat couldn't help but feel a sense of loss, as if something had passed between them in that brief exchange. The meeting continued, but his thoughts were elsewhere. As the day wore on, the diplomat found it harder and harder to focus. Every glance at the Queen left him with a strange, inexplicable feeling. Was it admiration? Or something deeper? He couldn't say. But one thing was clear, there was a connection between them, even if neither of them had the courage to acknowledge it. At the end of the day, the Queen excused herself from the table, as always, leaving the human diplomat to his thoughts. He watched her leave, his mind racing with questions. What was it that had changed between them? Was it just the stress of the summit? Or was there something more? The diplomat stood up and made his way to the observation deck of the spaceship. The stars stretched out before him in an endless expanse, their cold light flickering like distant memories. He leaned against the railing, his thoughts drifting as the soft hum of the ship filled the quiet. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, lost in his thoughts, when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find the Queen standing a few feet away, her gaze fixed on the stars as well. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, almost peaceful. Finally, it was the Queen who broke the silence. "You've been quiet today," she said softly.
Are you sure you're not hiding something, diplomat? He looked at her, meeting her gaze. There was no challenge in her eyes this time, just a quiet curiosity.
"Maybe I'm just thinking about the future," he said quietly. "About what comes next." The Queen nodded slowly. "Yes, the future. It's always in our hands, isn't it?" They stood there together, watching the stars. Neither of them spoke for a long time, but in that moment, something passed between them. A quiet understanding, a shared recognition of the weight they both carried. The Queen eventually turned to leave, her footsteps echoing softly as she walked away. The diplomat stayed behind, staring out at the stars, his mind racing with possibilities. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that the connection between him and the Queen was far from over. The days that followed the meeting were filled with uncertainty. The diplomat could not shake the feeling that the Queen's words had carried a deeper meaning. He had expected a clear decision by now, but instead, the summit's talks had grown even more complicated. The Queen had mentioned consulting her advisors, and since then, everything seemed to slow down. Every conversation with the Xeranthian delegates was tense, and even the smallest gestures felt loaded with significance. The human diplomat had never felt more out of place. He had faced countless challenges during his career, but nothing had ever been as overwhelming as the situation with the Queen. The politics of the galaxy were complicated, but it was the Queen's presence that made his heart race and his thoughts scatter. There was something about her, something he couldn't explain. Her cool, composed exterior hid a mind that was as sharp as any blade, and it made him nervous in a way he had never been before. It was late one evening when the human diplomat received an unexpected message from Queen Lyria. The message wasn't official, nor was it about the summit's progress. It was a simple invitation. "Join me on the observation deck. I have something I wish to discuss." It was brief, and it took him a moment to comprehend what it meant. For a brief instant, he wondered if it was a trap, or some kind of diplomatic game, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this was not like any other message he had received. It felt personal. Without hesitation, he responded, confirming his attendance. His heart thudded as he made his way to the observation deck, the vast expanse of space stretching out before him. The soft hum of the ship filled the air, and the stars outside twinkled in the darkness like tiny pinpricks in the fabric of the universe. As he approached the deck, he saw her standing there, looking out into the void, her back to him. Her posture was as regal as ever, but there was something different in the way she carried herself tonight. It was as if she had let her guard down, just a little. "Your Highness," the diplomat said, his voice breaking the silence. The Queen turned to face him, and for a moment their eyes met. There was a fleeting hesitation, but then she nodded, her expression softening just enough to show a hint of warmth. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice calm and measured. "I know this may seem unusual, but there is something I must say." He nodded, not knowing what to expect. "Of course. What's on your mind?" She gestured for him to come closer, and they both stood by the railing, looking out at the stars. The silence between them was thick, filled with the unspoken thoughts and feelings that had been building between them for days. The diplomat found himself suddenly aware of every small movement, every breath, as if the Queen's presence had amplified everything around him. She was closer now than she had ever been in a meeting. In fact, the space between them felt smaller than it had ever been, and yet, the Queen had not said a word to address the awkwardness that had passed between them earlier in the summit. "I've been thinking a lot about our talks," she began, her voice low, almost distant, "about the future of the Empire and Earth." "I know how important this is," the diplomat replied. "Not just for Earth, but for both of our people. We can build something great together if we're willing to trust each other." The Queen's eyes flickered with a hint of sadness, but she quickly masked it. "I've seen many diplomats come and go, many alliances formed and broken, promises made and broken again. The galaxy is filled with betrayal, and the Zaranthian Empire has learned to survive by not trusting easily." Her words were heavy, and the diplomat felt the weight of them. He could sense the years of responsibility that weighed on her shoulders, the burden of leadership that was not often shared. The Queen had been in power for decades, and the diplomat had only just begun to understand the true cost of such a position.
"You don't have to do this alone," he said gently. "There's a different path we can take."
One where trust, rather than fear, is the foundation. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the stars, as though searching for something in their distant glow. "Trust," she repeated softly, almost to herself. "It's not so simple." The diplomat stepped closer, feeling the distance between them grow smaller. "I understand. But I believe it's possible, Your Highness. Together, we can create something lasting." The Queen remained silent, her eyes scanning the endless expanse of space. The diplomat, sensing her hesitation, waited. He didn't know what more to say, so he simply stood there, offering her the space to speak when she was ready. And after a long pause, she finally spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were right. You know," she said, her gaze still fixed on the stars. "The future we want, it's not something I can achieve alone, and yet, for so long, I've had to carry that burden, to make decisions that affect millions of lives. And yet, I've had to shut out my own desires, my own feelings, because it's easier that way. It's safer." The diplomat could hear the vulnerability in her words, and for the first time he saw the Queen not as the powerful ruler she was known to be, but as a person, someone who carried her own doubts and fears. He had always seen her as someone untouchable, someone beyond the reach of anyone else. But now, in this moment, he understood that she too was human.
"I never expected to find someone like you," the Queen continued, her voice growing quieter.
Someone who sees the world in a way that challenges everything I've believed. You've made me question things I thought I understood. Her words struck him deeply, and he couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something more. Something beyond diplomacy. He didn't know where it would lead, but there was a connection between them, one that went beyond mere politics. It was something deeper, something that neither of them had expected. "Your Highness," he said, his voice steady, "we can build that future together. I don't have all the answers, but I believe we can find them, side by side. The Queen turned to face him fully, her eyes meeting his with a depth that left him breathless. I don't know what the future holds, diplomat, but I do know this. You've shown me that there is hope. And for the first time in a long time, I feel as though I might be able to trust again. The diplomat felt a warmth spread through him, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire galaxy had narrowed down to this single moment, this shared understanding between them. The Queen, for all her power and control, was just a person, much like him, facing the same uncertainties and struggles. I won't let you down, he said quietly, his voice filled with conviction. The Queen gave him a small but genuine smile, a rare sight for those who served her. It was a smile that spoke of something unspoken, something that had been building between them since their first meeting. And in that moment, the diplomat realized that he had crossed a threshold. The barrier between them had been broken, and they were no longer just diplomat and Queen. They were two people standing on the edge of something new. For the rest of the evening, they stood together, watching the stars in silence. There was no need for more words. They both knew that the future was uncertain, but for the first time, it didn't feel as daunting. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And that was enough. The days following the quiet conversation on the observation deck were filled with an odd sense of anticipation. The human diplomat couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted between him and Queen Lyria, though neither of them had openly acknowledged it. The diplomatic talks continued, as they had before, with the usual exchanges of proposals and counterproposals. But now, there was an unspoken understanding that lingered between them, something that neither could ignore. It was in the way the Queen would glance at him during the meetings, her gaze soft and thoughtful, as though she was seeing him not just as a representative of Earth, but as something more. The diplomat, for his part, found himself more focused than ever. His commitment to the success of the summit hadn't wavered, but there was a newfound sense of purpose in his work. He knew that his mission was still to secure an alliance with the Zaranthian Empire, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the alliance wasn't just a matter of politics. It was about something deeper, something that involved trust, connection, and understanding, and it seemed that the Queen was beginning to realize that as well. The following week, the human diplomat was summoned once again to the Queen's chambers. It wasn't unusual for him to be called for a meeting. After all, he was the chief representative of Earth. But this time, the request had come not through official channels, but in a personal message from the Queen herself. I wish to speak with you privately. Please join me in my quarters. As he made his way through the sprawling corridors of the Zaranthian palace, the diplomat couldn't help but feel the weight of the invitation. It wasn't just a simple request for a meeting. It was personal. The air felt charged, and he wondered if this would be the moment when the Queen finally spoke her mind, when they both acknowledged what had been growing between them. But even as he thought this, doubt crept in. What if he was misreading everything? What if the Queen was simply focused on the negotiations, and his thoughts had no place in this equation? When he arrived at the Queen's quarters, he was greeted by two of her guards, who allowed him entry without a word. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the soft glow of distant stars filtering through the windows. The Queen stood by the far side of the room, looking out at the stars, her posture as regal as ever. But there was something different about her tonight. The usual air of control that surrounded her seemed slightly more relaxed, more vulnerable.
Your Highness, the diplomat said softly, stepping forward.
The Queen turned slowly, her gaze meeting his. There was no hint of the coldness that had once defined their interactions, only a quiet understanding that seemed to have grown between them. Thank you for coming, she said, her voice calm, but there was something in it, something that suggested she had been waiting for this moment. He nodded, unsure of what to say.
Of course. What is it you wish to discuss? The Queen motioned for him to sit, and he did, taking a seat across from her.
She remained standing, her eyes thoughtful as she looked down at her hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people are contemplating something important, something that neither is yet ready to fully voice. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "about everything that has happened. The summit, the talks, and
Us! The diplomat's heart skipped a beat.
He had been waiting for her to say something like this, but hearing it aloud still took him by surprise. His mouth suddenly felt dry, and he had to swallow before he could speak. "I understand, Your Highness," he said carefully. "It's been a lot to process for both of us." She nodded, and for the first time, she seemed to allow herself a small, fleeting smile.
Yes, it has. But it's more than that, isn't it?
More than just the summit and the alliance. Something has changed between us, and I think we both know it. The diplomat's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The moment of truth. He had suspected that the Queen felt the same way, but now, hearing her admit it, he wasn't sure what to do with the realization. It was one thing to feel a connection with someone, but it was another thing entirely to acknowledge that connection, especially in such a high-stakes situation. "I can't deny it," he said finally, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts racing through his mind. "There's something between us, something I never expected, but I've always believed that our bond could lead to something greater, not just for us, but for our people." The Queen's expression softened, and she took a step closer, her eyes searching his. "I never thought I would feel this way again. I've spent my entire life making decisions that were for the greater good of the Empire, but I've never allowed myself to consider what I truly want. Until now." The diplomat could feel the weight of her words. He understood the burden of leadership all too well. The Queen had sacrificed much to rule her people, and yet here she was, sharing her vulnerability with him. It was a side of her he had never seen before, and it made him feel both honored and conflicted. "You don't have to make decisions alone anymore," he said, his voice low but full of conviction. "We can do this together. We can lead together, not just in politics, but in everything."
I believe that, if we work together, we can create something lasting.
Something that will stand the test of time.
For a moment, the Queen said nothing.
She simply stared at him, as if trying to read his soul. And in that silence, the diplomat wondered if she would reject his words, if she would remind him of the weight of their positions, of the impossibility of a relationship between them. But instead, she took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "I've made many choices in my life, and most of them have been for the Empire," she said. "But perhaps it's time to make a choice for myself." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time the diplomat felt as though they were no longer just two representatives of their respective worlds. They were two people, standing on the edge of something new and uncertain, but something they both felt could be worth pursuing. "I don't know what the future holds," the Queen continued, "but I am willing to find out. With you." The diplomat felt a rush of emotions, relief, joy, hope, all swirling together. He had never expected this moment, but now that it was here, he realized how much he had longed for it. To be seen, not just as a diplomat, but as someone who could share this journey with her. They were both leaders, yes, but they were also people, and in that shared understanding, they had found something greater than political alignment.
"I don't want to promise that everything will be easy," he said, his voice steady. "But I do promise that I'll always stand by you."
"No matter what happens, we'll face it together." The Queen smiled then. A real smile. One that reached her eyes and softened her features. It was a rare sight, and it made the diplomat's heart skip a beat. Then, let's face it together. And in that moment, everything seemed to fall into place. They were no longer just two leaders caught in the tides of galactic politics. They were allies, partners, and perhaps, just perhaps, something more. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt full of possibilities. As the Queen turned toward the window, gazing out at the stars, the diplomat joined her, standing side by side. There was still much to be done. The The summit was not over, and their work was far from complete. But for the first time, they both knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. The stars outside shimmered with endless possibilities, each one a distant world full of its own stories. And as they stood there in the quiet of the Queen's chambers, the diplomat realized that their story, his and hers, had only just begun.